He turned off the TV and said, "Leave." I stayed quiet until the man showed up the next day. The click of the remote still lives in my ears. It sounded small, like a lid snapping shut, but the room folded into that silence as if someone had pressed their hand over the world. My coffee went cold beside my armchair. The steam had only just stopped rising. I sat very still in the green velvet, its pile worn where I had rested my knee for years, and watched Derek's face tighten into something I barely recognized. Lena did not speak. She did not meet my eyes. The light above the mantel caught the brass frame of our wedding photo and sent it back as a thin, indifferent line. "Go to your room, old woman," he said, and the phrase landed as though it had been practiced. Years can teach you how to swallow a thing and set it aside on a shelf. Widowhood teaches you how to make tea without someone noticing, to fold 2 sets of laundry into 1 basket and pretend it's fine, to give up the end of the bed because your grief is polite and has manners. But there is a difference between saving yourself and shrinking until you are a shape you no longer recognize. I had been shrinking for a long time. Derek was loud in the way some men think volume is authority. Lena had loved him once with a softness that wrapped around both of them like a blanket. I loved them both. That love is part of why I had stayed. But love does not require humiliation in its margins. The command? The way Lena looked away as if she could not see what was happening under the same roof. That was the tipping point. When the remote clicked off, I did what I have learned to do in moments when other people are trying to decide my future. I did not argue. I let my jaw unclench. I let my hands empty. I breathed in through my nose and out slowly, listening to the house settle. I looked at the deed on the bookshelf more by habit than intention. It had lived in a manila envelope for years between an old property map and a stack of receipts from when Harold and I renovated the porch. Harold taught me to handle papers like people, with patience, names visible, dates legible. He had worked in the county recorder's office for a short while before he got sick, and I finished my year there, 35 years before, in a job that taught me how weight rests in ink and seal and signature. That knowledge had never felt like power, only predictability. Until that afternoon, it had been an ordinary, unremarkable guarantee. I stood and went to the bookcase. The envelope was where it always had been, dull, labeled in Harold's neat hand. When I drew it out, the air in the room seemed smaller. The paper was thin, the edge smudged with a thumb that might have been my own. I held the deed in both hands like it was a cup of tea. It had my name on it. It had my husband's name on it, and the date when the county had accepted the transfer many years before. The year had been a different temperature then. We were younger. The porch paint was fresher. I stroked the embossed seal with the pad of my thumb and felt something gather in me that was not anger and not fear. It was clarity. I did not scream. I did not throw the remote. I carried the deed into my bedroom, where the light is soft and the curtains are a bit threadbare at the hem. I placed the paper on the nightstand and packed a small overnight bag, a navy sweater, a pair of sensible shoes, the blue cardigan my granddaughter likes, and a little bottle of lavender lotion I keep for when my hands forget what softness feels like. I took Lena's key from the hook by the door where she had tossed it that morning, and I left it there. I had no intention of leaving the house in a huff. I intended to leave with the architecture of the day still in place. Order calms a person when the world tilts. The hotel smelled of lavender and lemon soap. I chose a modest place a half-hour away, quiet, practical, where the kettle always sings like a little clock. In the small, polite room, I boiled water and made myself tea. The cup warmed my fingers, and I thought about patience. I thought about the county recorder's office, about tearing a roll of deeds out like a cake and stapling each parcel of someone's life into order. There is a particular dignity in bureaucracy if you let it hold you. Names on lines, dates recorded, a history that does not forget. That night I called Andrew Sterling. I had worked alongside him once, years back, when he was a junior clerk, and I was the one who taught him the drawer for mortgage releases. He had become an attorney with a voice that kept its old humor, and he always understood that people are not problems to be solved, but lives to be returned to shape. "Andrew," I said when he picked up. He paused, then said, "Celeste, is everything all right?" "No," I said, "not exactly, but I have something you might want to look at." He asked the necessary questions. Who was in the house? What happened? Had anyone threatened physical harm? And those questions hung like a net under the conversation. It is important to ask them. I am practical. I will not make you a hero simply because you are loud. I told him about the remote and the words Derek said. I told him Lena had not spoken. I told him as if it were a mere errand that I had the deed. Bring it to me in the morning, Andrew said after a moment. I'll take a look and call in a favor. I can't promise outcomes, state law varies, but we will make sure the right papers are filed and someone serves them properly. Properly, I repeated. The word felt honest in my mouth. Thank you. We spoke of notice to quit like people who have seen at least one messy dinner table. He promised me that there would be no shouting, no theater. He said the right papers and the right people can make space for a quieter sort of justice. I fell asleep to the drone of traffic I would not normally hear. I slept with my hand over the deed like a small blanket. In the morning, I went shopping for a uniform. I told myself it was practical. When you walk into a room you are planning to reclaim, you should look like someone who belongs there. I chose a navy blazer because navy is the color I wore to interviews and to the county office. I chose sensible shoes that did not announce their presence. I found a beige scarf with tiny peaches embroidered on it. The motif made me laugh, half out of nostalgia, and half because peach reminds me of my mother's cobbler, the scent of sugar and butter and summer heat. I wore that scarf the day I first met Derek properly, when he was still only a boy with earnest hair and an easy laugh. The scarf has since become a token of small rebellions. Andrew called mid-morning. My associate Roman will come by at 10, he said. He's thorough. Tell Lena and Derek there will be paperwork delivered today. It's routine, no theatrics. And Celeste, keep your receipts and your records. If there are any accounts in your name, check them and let me know if any cards were added as supplements. I made a list in my head of the accounts I had, the savings, the supplemental Social Security deposits, Harold's pension that had been set to come through for both our names until the end. I had kept a stack of statements in a box in the hall closet. I thought about the times I had marked my groceries and paid the gas bill and balanced the checkbook when we were both working. I thought about the small economy of our lives, which is often the overlooked place where power lives. That's all, Andrew said. And Celeste, don't do anything dramatic. Leave the confrontation to us. You show up as the owner. You are a quiet, legal fact. I stood in the doorway of my living room and looked at the green velvet again. It had a thumbnail worn into the arm where the fabric had given beneath a lifetime of elbows. I touched it and thought out how I had earned a right to this room that was quieter than either remark or reflex. I thought about dignity as something you carry into a room like a small lamp. It offers light, not thunder. Before Roman arrived, I made a few practical adjustments. For reasons of safety and to remove immediate leverage, Andrew advised we take practical financial steps, steps he arranged, not ones I invented. His advice was plain and cautious. Freeze any supplementary cards that might be attached to my accounts, have the utility companies notified that no changes may be made with a verified signature, and update passwords on accounts where possible. He cautioned that each jurisdiction handles these things differently and advised using his office as the point of contact for any disputes. He reminded me that paperwork does not shout, it simply exists. So I called. I spoke in my soft, precise voice and told them I was the primary account holder and wished to have certain cards blocked until I could verify account access. I called the power company and left a note in their customer portal that no changes were to be made without a signed form, Andrew's office number attached. These are not glamorous acts. They are the bones of a life. Lock the door, turn off the lights, set the rule. They are the small, effective habits that make an untenable chaos into a manageable sequence. Roman arrived in the late morning, just as the sun pushed its attention into the house and made a little trail across the rug. He did not have the swagger of a man who makes a scene. He carried a slim leather briefcase, and his shoes were the sort that whisper rather than shout. He introduced himself with a name tag clipped to his lapel, Roman P. Cruz. His voice was courteous, unhurried. He asked if I was Celeste Everson. I nodded. He opened his briefcase with an efficiency that reminded me of days behind a counter, hands moving in the practiced geometry of filing. He placed a manila envelope of his own upon my coffee table and smoothed it as if to make sure nothing inside was forgotten. The envelope contained a single document whose header said "Notice to Quit," plain as a house number. When he spoke, he did so with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for theatricality. "This is to inform you," he said to the room, using the formal voice one uses when reading the weather, "that your residence is owned by Mrs. Celeste M. Everson. This notice requires that any occupants either vacate or contest the claim according to their local statutory rights within the applicable period. It has been delivered on behalf of Andrew V. Sterling." Lena was in the doorway, holding a dish towel that had a small hole in one corner. Her face was colored with something between embarrassment and the dawning recognition that she had not been the one in charge of her home. Derek, who was leaning against the opposite wall with his arms folded, made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. Roman set the envelope down where it could be seen, and then did something I appreciated. He did not gloat. He simply left a business card, offered me a small nod, and packed his briefcase back up. He had the look of someone who had done his job and intended to leave it that way. He told them the papers had been served and that the firm would be available for any questions. He said these things with no triumph in his voice. After he left, the house felt as if it had been measured. There was a new weight in the air, but it was not the same weight as shame or menace. It was the weight of a fact placed on the table. Lena sank down into the armchair across from mine. She held the dish towel in both hands, as though it might be a shield against something she hadn't known she feared. For a while she said nothing. This is often how people come back to themselves, quietly, like a tide finding its level. "Mom," she said finally, voice small.
"I didn't know. You didn't have to know everything," I said. I reached out and took both of her hands. The skin of her knuckles hummed with heat and embarrassment. I felt forgiveness want to pour out of me like tea. But this was not a scene that needed to be smoothed over with sympathy. It needed to be understood. She started, then stopped. She tried to find a reason that would make sense of a man who thought his authority came from volume, not from a lease or a law, or even the smallest courtesy. There is a peculiarity to recognizing that someone you love has changed. It hurts. It ruins dinner plans and leaves you staring at mismatched plates long after the meal is done. "You can stay," I said, more plainly than I had expected. "You're my daughter. This house is your home in the way it has always been, but not like this, not under intimidation." She looked at me then, finally letting her eyes meet mine. There was sorrow there, and relief braided through it. "I'm sorry," she said. I let him speak like that." "You didn't let him," I said. "You thought you were keeping peace." We talked quietly about the practicalities Andrew had mentioned. We talked about the 30-day period, the time the law gives for either a tenant to vacate or to contest the notice, and what that might mean. I did not tell her this was a victory. It was a step. It was a move in a game with its own rules. "You did right," she said after a while. "You didn't make a show of it. You went and did what needed doing." I almost smiled. "Sometimes a deed is louder than a shout," I said. It came out as a small laugh, and Lena allowed herself to laugh too. The sound was thin, but real. That afternoon, I sat in my kitchen and began the sort of small domestic cataloging that brings order to anxious thoughts. I moved the boxes of bills to the table, opened envelopes, and checked the names on accounts. One supplementary card had my name on it, but carried Derek's transactions on the back. I called the bank and asked if they could flag it. The representative suggested a process in an office. I wrote down the name and the number and read it aloud to the empty kitchen, as if hearing it twice would make it stick. Andrew's office would follow up. He had told me the law varies, and this is true. But he had also said that making the right calls and documenting everything removes a great deal of fog. At dinner, we ate peach cobbler I had bought at the market, because peaches remind me of summers at my mother's. The scent of warm fruit and brown sugar somehow made the house feel kinder. For a while, the table was simply a table with food on it, and we ate with our hands, as if the world were still bearable. There is a kind of small courage in continuing ordinary meals after the color of your life has shifted. It is a refusal to let strangers rearrange the furniture of your days. That night, I slept in my own bed. The deed was back on the nightstand. It felt like a small, honest thing to sleep with a fact beside me. In the morning, when I brewed my first cup, I noticed a small quietness in the sunlight, as if the house was sitting up a fraction straighter. The next day, I visited the county recorder's office, not because I needed to prove myself, but because there is a certain comfort in seeing a legal trail laid out plainly. The clerk who knows me by name found the parcel, ran a copy, and handed it across the counter with a professional, sympathetic smile. I tucked that copy into my bag. Little anchors matter. An official signature in blue ink, the stamp of a county that does not know family stories, but knows the permanence of paper. On my way out of the office, I ran into Betty. She lives 2 doors down and makes the best lemon bars in the neighborhood. She handed me a dish towel without asking and said, "If you need something, dear, just say the word." There was no parade in her eyes, no theatrical handshake, only the steady solidarity of someone who has kept a watchful porch light for neighbors for decades. That afternoon, Roman came back. He did not raise his voice. He presented a copy of the document for Derek and Lena to sign if they wished to acknowledge receipt. His presence was, in the end, a simple formality dressed in professional clothing. When Derek took the paper and read it, his jaw tightened. He asked a few questions, more about the timeline than about the legitimacy. He tried to assert a version of events that might have been comfortable for him, that he had been a de facto partner in the house. Roman listened without interruption. He had the air of someone who knew the law would speak in its turn. When Derek asked if he could contest, Roman said quietly that he could, and that the process for contesting requires filings and perhaps hearings. He advised, with the unobtrusive courtesy of someone who has seen many human stories unfold, that contesting takes time and can be costly. "My firm can provide information," he said, "but those are decisions you or your counsel would need to make." Roman's formality did not inflame. It deflated melodrama like a careful hand smoothing a blanket. He folded his briefcase, and then he left. After he was gone, there was a long, slow moment in which the house felt neither hostile nor entirely mine. It felt like a space strung between 2 rules, the old habit of letting others dictate, and the new habit of standing to be counted. "Are you going to move out?" Derek asked at last, quieter than I had heard him be in months. "No," Lena answered for both of us. "Not unless I decide I need to." Derek snorted softly and left the room. The sound of his footfall up the stairs was a small punctuation. The house, without his presence for a moment, sounded different, like a clock ticking with a clearer cadence. I began to make plans. Not dramatic plans, no locks changed in the night, no revenge. I wrote down a list: painters, upholstery, a meeting with Andrew to review the documents he had prepared, and a date for Lena to bring her things into order if she wanted to stay. The list comforted me because it belonged to the domain of chores, and chores are the grammar of a life in progress. That evening, as dusk gathered stamps of blue across the living room windows, I found myself at the oven, reheating the peach cobbler. I set a small music box on the mantel and wound it until its tiny song began. I placed 2 cups of tea on a tray and took one to Lena. The volume of the music was mine to choose. I liked the way the notes threaded through the room and softened the edges of the day. We did not speak of the 30 days yet. There was no need to inflate that interval with anxieties. It would arrive like all such legal measures, on its own timetable, patient and indifferent. For now, we tended to the small things. Late that night, when the house had folded itself into quiet and the lamp by the armchair made a private circle of light, I sat and made another list. This one was different. It was not about painters or paperwork. It was about the next steps I would take if Lena needed them. Community resources, neighbors who could help move boxes, contacts at the bank Andrew trusted. I wrote down Betty and Olga and Zoe, and I wrote down the details Andrew had given me about the firm's intake process. Lists are not a refusal of feeling. They are a map through it. At bed, I lay awake for a while, thinking of the small, surprising arc of the last 2 days. A man had clicked a remote and asked me to leave my living room. The next day, another man, in sensible shoes, had placed a paper on the table and left the room to hold a space for quiet law to do its work. There was a cleanliness to that progression I found almost beautiful. It was a reminder that not all power needs to roar. Sometimes power simply sits where it belongs. I am not a woman given to theatrics. I have never wanted to be a spectacle. But I have come to believe that dignity is not a thing you acquire and tuck away. It is something you practice every day, like brushing your teeth or sweeping the floor. You practice it not because it will protect you from all harm, but because it gives you a place to stand when harm arrives. The next morning, before the sun had fully found the porch swing, my phone buzzed with a text from Andrew's office confirming that the paperwork had been filed and that there would be an initial conference if Derek chose to contest.
He added, in that careful way professionals have, that legal timelines vary. Consult your counsel. I read it twice and saved it. There was a knock at the door not long after. It was Betty, with lemon bars this time, and Olga from next door bringing a potted geranium because she said the living room would look lighter with a plant. They did not come as a surprise, nor did they come as a parade.
They came bearing the ordinary kindnesses, someone to listen, someone with an extra box, someone who could be counted on to show up at 10 when friends move furniture. Lena watched them put the plant on the windowsill and the lemon bars on the coffee table. She, who had been cloaked in silence for days, began to talk in stops and starts, about regrets, about the way Derek had been different in private, about how she had excused small cruelties as stress. Her voice trembled, then steadied. The house hummed with domestic chatter, the neighborly music of people who have lived long enough to know that life's troubles are often best handled with pies and practical help. I made a decision that afternoon. I would not make the house into a courtroom. I would make it into a place where things were in order, and where people who loved me could feel safe. But I would not allow being kind to be a synonym for being treated as less than. There is a line between hospitality and surrender, and I had learned to recognize its shape. When I turned the key in the front door at night, the metal made a sound that feels like permission. It is a small domestic thing to hear a key in a lock, and yet it reassures in a way no speech can. I went to bed that night with the house settled around me, with a list of errands and a future appointment with Andrew, and with the knowledge that in a few weeks, the law would require a formal step, either vacating or contesting. I wondered what Derek would do. I wondered if Lena would decide to stay, or to leave for a while to find her own balance. I wondered how it would feel when the movers came, or when the house was repainted a soft peach the next spring. I pictured the small rituals I would reclaim, the kettle on in the morning, music at a volume I chose, the green velvet armchair once again a respectful companion rather than a contested object. And then, just as I was folding the last of the tea towels, the phone rang. It was Roman again, calling to confirm a time to return with documentation and to set the record with the neighbors should anyone inquire. His voice was the same, clear and unornamented. "We served the notice," he said. "If they choose to contest, your attorney will be notified. Otherwise, there is a period before further action is taken." I thanked him, and he hung up with the same quiet efficiency with which he had arrived. The house seemed to exhale. I put the tea towels back in their drawer and closed it. There are moments in a life where the simplest motions, putting away a towel, sweeping a crumb, answering a phone, become acts of stewardship. They assert that your life is worth the care you give it. They are not grand. They do not have to be. They are enough. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening. Lights came on behind curtains, and the scent of cooking drifted between houses. There is a comfort in the ordinary pattern of streetlights and late commuters, in people returning to their own thresholds. I made one more cup of tea and took it to my armchair. The green velvet held me with its familiar embrace. I turned the small music box again and let the melody thread through the room. I opened the deed, touched the embossed seal, and felt the small, undeniable fact of it beneath my thumb. There are chapters in life where one must choose to act in a way that preserves dignity rather than seeking vengeance. That afternoon, watching Lena set the dish towel aside and step toward me across the rug, I felt the strange, quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly, not loud, not vindictive, but precise. The papers were in motion, the neighbors were kind, and the legal machinery, slow, indifferent, but orderly, had been set into motion. It would not, I knew, resolve everything. Law is patient. It is not a miracle. But it is a tool, and I had chosen to use it. When I closed my eyes that evening, I did not see Derek's face. I saw the kitchen table with lemon bars and a new geranium. I saw Lena laughing at a private, small joke, a sound that means someone is coming back to herself. I saw Roman's quiet efficiency as he walked across the porch and left a paper on my coffee table. I thought about the next day and the days after, about painters and bank calls and the slow work of returning a house to order. There was a peace to be had in paper and in people who do their jobs cleanly. I had not imagined that a man coming the next day with a briefcase could alter the architecture of my afternoon. It had, and in doing so he had given me a space to breathe. The living room was, for now, mine to steward. I had a friend at a law firm, a list of neighbors who would hold boxes, and the knowledge that I did not have to be less in order to be loved. The morning the conference was set, the house felt as if someone had smoothed a tablecloth over it and tucked the corners neatly. Everything held in place, all the edges aligned. Days will do that if you let them. They give you an ordered sequence of small tasks, and in those tasks, your mind can unlace fear into something useful. I found in the intervening mornings that making the bed straightened more than the sheets. It helped me breathe. The days between Roman's second visit and the conference were not dramatic. They were catalogues of small resistances. Derek took to leaving his boots in the hall where they made a point. He would come and go at odd hours as if sending the house an errand. Once I found a mug in the sink with lipstick at its rim, something small and defiant that felt less like a message to me than the mark of someone who had decided the house was a buffet. He muttered sometimes when Lena entered a room, as if trying to annoy the surface of our lives into breaking. Mostly, though, he found the quiet bureaucratic order I had set intolerable. It made his loudness inelegant. Lena and I filled the spaces with ordinary things. We mended a lampshade that had a soft burn from years of reading.
We brushed dust from the brass frame on the mantel and replaced the silk flowers in the vase by the window with the geranium Olga had brought. We made lists and crossed off small items with the satisfying scrape of a pen. Each crossing off felt like a little return of agency. On the morning of the conference, I dressed slowly. I wore the navy blazer again, the one I had bought as armor, and the peach scarf. Peach had become more than a color. It was a mood, a small insistence upon warmth. At the door, I patted the deed in my bag as if it were a talisman. It is strange. Paper confers no moral superiority, no spiritual badge, and yet when it bears the right number and the right seal, it becomes a way of saying, plainly, who one is. It is an ordinary kind of truth. Andrew's office smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. He has a large, sensible desk and a chair that looks like it has seen many long conversations. He greeted me with that steady humor I mentioned before, and in the same motion, motioned Lena and me into a small conference room where Roman and another man sat waiting. The other man introduced himself as a paralegal who handled filings. He had the polite, efficient air of someone who could make time appear like a neatly filed folder. Derek arrived last, late enough to look flustered, with his hair not quite combed in a way that suggested bother rather than fashion. He did not bring an attorney. He looked around the room as if expecting applause, and found instead an array of documents and faces that asked for facts. Facts are not loud. They are patient and constable-like. Andrew opened the conference with the kind of voice that renders the room useful. "We're here to review the facts," he said. "This is not a place for loud arguments. There are documents that establish ownership, and there are records we'll look at for financial clarity." He placed a copy of the deed on the table. It took up a small, respectable amount of room. He placed another folder beside it marked Statements. I could feel Derek's frustration like static. He tried to speak twice before Andrew asked him to let the facts have their turn. "I've paid for things here," he said in a clipped way. He trailed off, as one does when a claim is more sentiment than ledger. Andrew nodded. "We understand relationships are complicated," he said. "What we need to look at are objective records. There are transactions, payments, and a ledger of contributions. This will clarify what's been paid, in whose name, and what liabilities, if any, rest where." The paralegal handed over a stack of papers, mortgage receipts from years ago, bank statements, and a ledger that Andrew explained had been compiled to show household expense flows. There was also a packet of broker statements, a name I had not thought of in recent years until that afternoon, statements in an envelope that had been gently requested after I mentioned discrepancies in the household accounts. Andrew, with the patient stare of someone who has read too many human excuses, slid one open. The broker statements did not accuse. They listed dates and titles, purchases and withdrawals, and the occasional line item of a debit card purchase that did not correspond to any household bill. They told, in their neutral printed way, of cards being used for takeout, for fuel late at night, for electronics. They showed transfers that left my accounts with smaller cushions than I had expected. Nothing in those pages was a moral judgment. It was arithmetic. Lena's face turned as the pages turned. The light across from her cheekbone caught the edge of a tear and made it like a small bead of glass. I didn't know some of these charges," she said. Her voice shook as if a little of the untruth of her life was being lifted away. "It hurts to learn that things you trusted were not as they seemed. I had been careful with our papers, but there are corners of a marriage where you cannot always see the back of a ledger." Andrew explained what they showed with procedural detachment. "This indicates that several supplementary cards were used," he said. "Mrs. Everson's name is on the accounts. Therefore, the bank recognizes her as the primary. That creates a pattern the court can consider when determining possession claims. I must emphasize, each jurisdiction treats these matters differently. This is not an absolute victory. It is a set of facts." Derek opened his mouth and closed it again. He tried a few lines about partnership and contribution, about the unpaid hours he had given at odd jobs, about how he had fixed things around the house. People tell small truths sometimes when they think it serves them. The ledger is less romantic than a story of noble effort. It is patient and lists numbers. At a point in which Derek looked as if he might grow angry, Lena stood. Her face was clean, and by then lined not with shame alone, but with readiness. "I'm sorry," she said. Not to me, in the bland, habitual way people sometimes apologize, but to the room, as if offering a truth. "I should have seen it. I should have known to check. I'm sorry I let this happen, and I'm sorry I let him make me smaller for so long." Her apology was an internal act. It was not a plea for me. It was a reclaiming of her own agency. Derek, who had depended on others to do the moral laundry of his life, was suddenly exposed to the language of consequence. He complained about fairness, about how the picture had been painted unfairly. The room listened. The ledger does not negotiate fairness. It shows what has occurred. Andrew set the time frame plainly. "Because there is a deed in Mrs. Everson's name, we have established a prima facie ownership. A notice to quit has been served. If there is contestation, they may file to contest the notice within the statutory period. If no contest is filed, the process moves forward. Contesting requires filings. It can be time-consuming and costly." He looked at Derek and did not add color. Derek's options shrank in that room the way a pool does when you lower the water. He grumbled about pride and dignity and about being cast out unjustly. He tried for a final flourish of rhetoric, how the house had sometimes felt like his, but language spent without ledger is like a speech without weight. In the end, Derek did not file. Perhaps he thought the expense too great, or the work of contesting too invasive into a life he had not wanted scrutinized. Perhaps he decided, as some do, that the cost of proving a claim in court is often the thing that makes the claim moot. I do not know all the thoughts that moved behind his choices. I only know the sequence of what he did. He stayed for a week longer, and then, by the measure of small things, began to move boxes. I poured water into the plant Olga had brought and set the lemon bars on the counter. The house seemed to breathe. The first thing I did was not grand. I took a sponge and a bowl of warm, soapy water and washed the coffee table. The cloth left a damp trail glistening for a moment, and then the wood took on a matte, civilian silence. I cleaned the hearth. I emptied the sticky jar of loose change from the top of the dresser and counted it as if each coin were a small votive. There is a particular satisfaction in returning domestic things to their expected state. It is a reassertion that order can be rebuilt. Then I focused on the paint. I had always liked peach. The color suggests a domestic warmth that is gentle but firm. The painters arrived with ladders and tarps and the sort of easy, practical conversation people in trades tend to have. They chatted about the weather and the way sunlight would hit the living room late in the afternoon. They covered the floors like careful surgeons and worked with a quiet. That afternoon, the house surrendered to the new color as if it had been waiting for it. Walls that had heard arguments and whispered apologies now took on a hue that felt like a soft exhale. After the house was painted and the green velvet returned, I made an invitation. It felt natural to gather the women who had stood beside me and turn my small victory into a practical lesson. I asked Betty to help me set up the kitchen, and Olga to bring napkins, and Zoe to lend me her folding chairs. We put lemon bars on a plate, brewed tea, and set about talking. The workshop I had in mind was not a lecture. It was a neighborly conversation about how to keep small things in order so that no one in their later years might find themselves suddenly adrift. I spoke plainly about the paperwork I had kept, the deed, the bank statements, where the passwords were written, where the spare keys lay. I talked about the small financial steps Andrew had advised, freezing supplemental cards, contacting institutions, and how I had felt doing those acts. I was careful with my language. This is not a how-to. People in different places will have different paths, and the law does not work the same everywhere. I added the one-off line Andrew made me repeat to my neighbors. Legal timelines vary, and a local attorney can guide the specific steps you might take. They listened with that kind of attention neighbors give when the story has the texture of a lived thing rather than an abstract fear. Betty asked about wills, and I told her where we kept ours and why it was in my husband's drawer. Olga asked about passwords, and Zoe wrote down the name of a password manager that a cousin recommended. We made a list of local resources: a senior legal aid clinic, a bank liaison, a social worker who helped arrange home care if needed. For an hour, we stitched a small community safety net out of practical knowledge.
We traded recipes, which is the only currency some women trust more than money, and I taught them how to fold a list of important numbers into an envelope and tape it to the back of a cupboard where a neighbor could find it in an emergency. Lena came that day. She arrived carrying a box of her things and a small apology that sounded like a beginning rather than an end. She helped set the chairs with a deliberate care, placing cups gently as if in penance, and as if she were learning gentleness anew. She stayed as a guest in the house, not because she was helpless, but because she wanted a space to decide. I insisted she remain that way. A guest has rights of kindness extended, and also obligations to boundaries respected. Our conversations shifted. We began to speak about what had happened, not as an indictment, but as a course correction. I urged her to consider financial counseling. She agreed and made an appointment at the bank's consumer advice line Andrew had recommended. She asked to attend some of the workshops I planned for the neighborhood. It was not a public shaming. It was a practical curriculum in grown-up things she had never been taught with clarity. Over the months that followed, the house settled into a different rhythm. I kept my tea times. I turned the music on at the volume I chose. The green velvet sat in its place like an older friend, a little flatter at the knees and perfectly forgiving. We had new rituals: Saturday mornings for mending clothes, Wednesday afternoons for the neighborhood book club, the first Thursday of every month for our small legal literacy roundtable, where neighbors would bring questions, and we would answer with the voice of careful experience rather than the glare of speculation. I did not gloat. There is no sweetness in being victorious while enjoying someone's fall. My satisfaction was of a more temperate sort. It was knowing that a place where humiliation once sat was once again a place where a woman could sit and have tea without being told to move. It was the quiet correction of a wrong, the reestablishment of a norm where civility and legal clarity had reclaimed a room. Lena changed in small increments. She learned to check a bank statement and to insist upon receiving passwords rather than trusting them to a pocket. She began to answer the phone with a steadier voice when old acquaintances called. She attended a few of the neighborhood sessions and told us, in a voice that had surprised us all with its steadiness, about how it felt to begin to understand adult financial responsibility. At the very end of a summer, she told me she had applied for a course in bookkeeping, a small, sensible step that made me proud in the marrow of things. Our relationship was mended along practical seams. She understood finally that agreeing to be small does not mean love, it means accommodation. We rebuilt trust with policy and with conversation. She came to me sometimes to ask about a deposit or a name on a ledger. Sometimes she came simply for the peach cobbler. Those days we ate quietly in the afternoon with the music box playing, and the house felt like a room where life could be ordinary and good. Community changed too. The neighbor workshops became, after that first meeting, a modest program. Word spread slowly. The bank rep who had given advice agreed to speak once. A paralegal who volunteered came and explained in plain language what a notice to quit was and how one might consult counsel. We handed out copies of checklists that were sensible without being prescriptive, lists of documents to keep, places to store keys, names of reputable trade people. None of it was magic. None of it promised outcomes. It promised preparedness. In a neighborhood, preparedness is often an act of love. Months later, on a late afternoon when the sun filtered in that exact way it does through the lace curtains, I sat in the green velvet with a cup of tea and the deed on my knee. The house had that particular smell of being lived in, lemon and lavender, dust and a faint scent of wool from a scarf. I opened the deed and ran my thumb over the embossed seal, as if to remind myself that paper is a friend when properly used. There was one small, private ritual I performed every now and then. I would take the remote and place it in the little bowl by the mantel, face down. It felt like a tiny claim, not because the remote itself was a talisman, but because the act of deciding the sound in my living room, what music played and when,
was a right I had earned again. The remote's click is an ordinary domestic sound, and it is also the sound of a life that can choose. I think about the man who turned off the television and told me to leave. I try not to let the image harden into a villainous picture. People are rarely only villains. There was a moment when his voice had more force than his deeds, but when confronted with paper and polite procedure, his loudness dimmed to its real size. The man with the briefcase, Roman, was the vessel through which that procedural clarity arrived. He was not dramatic. He was not triumphal. He was a professional whose presence allowed me to stand in a fact. Facts, as I keep saying, are patient. On a quiet evening a few months after the house was repainted, Lena and I sat on the porch swing and watched the neighborhood settle into its own private rhythms. A child on the block played the same game the children have always played, counting the cracks on the sidewalk as if they were islands. The setting sun washed everything in a soft peach light that made even the paint seem warm. "You did right," Lena said at one point, as if reminding herself as much as me. "I did what I could," I answered. "You did what you could." There was no need for theatrics. We had both been apprenticed to a new kind of adultness.
We invited Derek once, after everything had quieted, to return a set of keys and to retrieve a plant he had cared for. He came without protest and left the plant with a word of thanks that sounded like a man who had been reduced to a smaller dignity and was learning its measure. We were not interested in scandals. We were interested in the ordinary restoration of household order. He took his plant, thanked us, and left. There is something that happens, I have noticed, when one reclaims a space with decency rather than with rancor. The space becomes hospitable to others who need shelter. I opened my house for a local support group once a month. The women who came to the kitchen table had stories to tell, small domestic defeats, recoveries, and the usual announcements. We traded recipes and resources, which is the domestic equivalent of armament. People find help in sharing both their lemon bars and their paperwork. Not much in the long arc of life is spectacular. The epical moments are usually made of small actions: a phone call to a bank, a visit to a county office, a cup of tea served with care. Those things do not look like power, but when gathered, they become a set of tools. I am often asked, quietly, as neighbors ask over hedges, what advice I would give to someone who finds themselves in the place I was. I always answer with the one sentence my old colleague Andrew made me repeat to others: legal timelines and procedures vary by jurisdiction. Consult your counsel for specifics. Beyond that, I tell them what worked for me. Keep a copy of your deed in a safe and remembered place. Keep your bank statements at hand. Have a neighbor you trust who can bring lemon bars or boxes at a moment's notice. Teach each other what to do with passwords and where to file wills. That last one is not glamorous, but it is necessary. Weeks became months, and the house continued to settle. The green velvet taught me patience. In the end, it didn't matter if someone thought they could order me out of a room. The room, like a faithful instrument, waits for the person who will play it true. I practice playing it again. The moment I like to keep in memory is small and private. It was late November and the first cool air had come. Lena had cooked a stew, and we were eating at the small kitchen table, our cups of tea steaming in the lamplight. The music was set to a volume that felt right to me, neither anonymous nor intrusive. We ate in a comfortable silence punctuated by a few small jokes. At one point, Lena reached across the table and touched my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this about winning or about revenge, for giving me the space to choose." I thought about the days when I had sat like a small figure in a room that was too loud, and about the time when a man with a remote had pressed the world into a silence I did not expect. I thought about the man with a briefcase who had come the next day and made that silence into a paper fact. I thought, too, of all the neighbors who had brought lemon bars and upholstery suggestions, and who had, without thinking it dramatic, made a safety net. "Boundaries," I said finally, not as a lecture, but as a concluding line. They keep people safe. They are an act of care, sometimes for the person who sets them, sometimes for the one who needs to be shown where the line stands. Lena squeezed my hand. Outside, the street lamp clicked on like a patient witness. The house hummed with ordinary life. The kettle had cooled, the music had dwindled into its last bar, and the green velvet held us like a companion. The peach paint warmed the room and made it soft as a memory. If there is an explanation for the way things unfolded for me, it is not legal magic nor a shorthand of revenge. It is the slow assembly of facts and quiet community. It is the decision to let procedure do what procedure does best, to convert a complaint into an organized claim, and to let those whose duty it is carry it forward. It is finally the choice not to be smaller because someone else has decided to make you so. When the day grows long and the house becomes the sort of place where a song can play at your chosen volume and where the tea is warm enough and the light is right, there is a dignity in that ordinary sovereignty. It is a humble kind of power. It does not make headlines. It makes life livable. A brief note in the plainest language. The steps I described were the right ones for my circumstance, with an attorney who advised me. Laws vary by state and country. If you face a similar situation, consult a local lawyer or legal aid services to understand your options. If this story has spoken to you and you would like to hear more lived experiences of quiet restoration, please subscribe. And if you're willing, share in the comments one small boundary you set that reclaimed space for you, or simply tell me where you're watching from. I always like to know which porch lights are on as the day closes.